On the 20th of May 1935, at a grass airfield just outside Augsburg, a small single-seat aircraft made its maiden flight. It was powered by a British engine, built by a company that the German Air Ministry didn't trust, and designed by a man that many of them actively disliked. 10 years later, over 33,000 of these aircraft had been built, more than the Spitfire, Hurricane, Mustang or Zero, in fact more than any fighter aircraft in aviation history. Flying combat missions over almost every country in Europe and even some in Africa, this aircraft would evolve as the war progressed, staying competitive throughout and cementing itself as one of the most iconic aircraft ever built. This is the design, development and the decade-long evolution of the Messerschmitt Bf109. To understand the design philosophy of the 109, you first need to understand why it was even designed in the first place, and critically, by whom. In March 1933, the German Air Ministry, or the RLM, published a very exciting document with an equally thrilling title, LA 1432/33. This document was the requirement for a new single-seat fighter aircraft, designed to replace the Arado 64 and Heinkel 51 in the still secret Luftwaffe. The requirements called for the new aircraft to have a top speed of 400 km/h at 6,000 meters, a height that it should be able to reach within 17 minutes. Power was to be provided by the 700 horsepower UMO 210, an inverted V12, and the fighter was to be armed with either a single 20mm cannon, twin 7.92mm machine guns, or, if possible, all three. This was going to be an extremely lucrative contract, so three big German aviation firms, Focke-Wulf, Arado and Heinkel, were invited to participate. But there was also an invite sent to a far smaller team, the struggling Bayerische Flugzeugwerke, or Bavarian Aviation Works. This was somewhat surprising, as the director of the RLM, a guy called Erhard Milch, held a massive personal grudge toward BFW's chief designer, Willy Messerschmitt. See, Milch had previously been the head of Lufthansa, which had suffered a number of crashes using Messerschmitt designs, so it wasn't entirely without reason. Anyway, Willy and his engineers worked to a simple design philosophy. If something didn't actively help the new aircraft win the competition, it didn't go on the aircraft. This philosophy meant that the Bf109 was essentially the smallest possible airframe mated to the largest possible engine, with as many low drag and weight-saving features as possible. And this was in stark contrast to some of its competitors. The team at Arado couldn't find a way for their retractable landing gear to work, so their AR-80 had fixed landing gear. Meanwhile, Hans Sander, Focke-Wulf's own test pilot, said that their parasol wing FW159 lacks practically everything that characterized a fighter of the latest generation. Neither of these progressed. In the end, only the Heinkel design, the HE112, would emerge as a worthy competitor. During initial head-to-head trials in October 1935, the Bf109 proved to be the faster aircraft, topping out at 467 km/h compared to the HE112's 440 km/h. At this point, both were powered by a British Rolls-Royce Vulture engine, as the Junkers UMO design wasn't yet ready. Further tests with the UMO engines in March 1936 showed that the 109 was faster, but that the 112 was more maneuverable. However, on the 2nd of March, during spin tests, the Heinkel crashed. The Bf109, of course, would end up winning the contract, but it wasn't actually this crash that sealed the deal. The 109 was designed to be significantly cheaper and faster to produce, with less compound curves and far simpler construction throughout. In fact, the main fuselage to wing joint required just 3 pins. It was an aircraft designed and purpose-built for mass production, and in March 1936, Messerschmitt's Bf109 was selected as Germany's new fighter. But work had only just begun. The wartime Bf109s are by far the most famous. The yellow-nosed Bf109Es over Britain in 1940, the sleek F models over North Africa, or the G models tangling with American heavy bombers over Berlin. But these don't tell the full story. The success of the 109 was thanks to far earlier aircraft. The 109s that were flying in 1935 and 1936 were not final designs, they were Versuchsflugzeug, experimental aircraft. The first Bf109 was the Bf109 V1 with the Rolls-Royce engine, and then the next was the V2 with the UMO. These were prototypes used for testing and development. The V3 was the first to be armed, with two 7.92mm machine guns in the cowling. The V3 was also the first aircraft they attempted to arm with a nose-mounted cannon firing through the engine block, an idea that ran into immediate vibration and overheating problems. The V4 would substitute the 20mm cannon for a third 7.92mm machine gun while they ironed these issues out. V3 and V4 would be the first two 109s to see combat, being sent to Spain as part of Jagdgruppe 88. Over the next 3 years, Spain would prove to be a perfect testing ground for the early 109s, allowing designers to tweak the aircraft, for Luftwaffe officials to develop tactics, and for pilots to gain experience in combat scenarios. But anyway, the A-series aircraft can be viewed as sort of a pre-production batch based on the V4 prototype, with a 3 machine gun loadout. But despite there being only about 22 A models produced, they all varied quite a lot. It was actually in the B series that we started to see some good German standardized production. The Bf109B, or Bertha, was the first production batch. The B1 was fitted with a 661 horsepower UMO 210D engine driving a 2-blade fixed pitch propeller. However, during the production run, a variable pitch propeller was developed and retrofitted to many B1s, which then became B2s. A total of 341 Berthas were produced, but experience in Spain showed that its armament of just 3 rifle-caliber machine guns was inadequate, and there were still issues with the engine-mounted gun. The C models were another transitional batch based on the V11, with only 58 produced in the spring and summer of 1938. The Caesar mounted a more powerful engine, the UMO 210G, with direct fuel injection, and also enjoyed a strengthened wing containing 2 more machine guns. Back in 1934, the RLM had stipulated that while the aircraft was going to mount the UMO 210, it should be designed to also mount a much more powerful engine, the 33.9-litre Daimler-Benz DB600. This engine, also powering Heinkel's HE-111 bomber, provided a massive 960 horsepower at takeoff and would be used in the new D-series aircraft. But of course, Nazis being Nazis, this was mostly propaganda. The DB600 was not yet considered reliable enough or available in large enough numbers to equip the 647 Doras, so the vast majority still mounted the UMO 210 and were identical to the C model aircraft. But the facade didn't necessarily make the D model bad, and successful sales were made to both Hungary and Switzerland for the handsome new machines. In late 1938, the Bf109E entered production, and this new aircraft did actually mount the Daimler-Benz power plant, in this case the DB601A with around 990 horsepower at takeoff. It was a larger and heavier engine though, so the entire nose needed redesigned. The early models had a chin-mounted radiator, but it needed to be a lot larger to cool the DB601, and a large radiator below the nose would create lots of drag. Instead, the radiators were moved backwards to the wings, with only an oil cooler in the chin. This moved the centre of gravity of the aircraft rearwards, doing a lot to balance the heavier engine in the nose, which drove a heavier 3-bladed propeller. Fun side note here, the BF in Bf109 and Bf110 stand for Bayerische Flugzeugwerke, of which Messerschmitt was just one part of, until 1938 when it was reconstituted as Messerschmitt AG. That's why it's Bf109 but ME262. ME109 is technically incorrect as it was a pre-1938 design. A total of 1,183 Bf109E1s were produced by this new Messerschmitt AG, forming the backbone of the Luftwaffe as they cleaned up in Spain and prepared for the looming war in mainland Europe. But there was a problem. It still only had 4 machine guns. The Germans knew that the British machines, the Hurricane and the Spitfire, had double that. As a result, the V20 prototype, eventually built in small numbers as the E2, had 2 wing-mounted machine guns and a 20mm cannon in the nose. But again, this did not work very well. Still too much vibration and too many thermal problems. The V16 and V17 were more promising, offering enough structural improvements to the single-spar wing design that they could replace the wing-mounted MGs with 20mm cannons. This was widely adopted as the E3 and gave the Luftwaffe pilots the punch they needed to equal the British aircraft. An improved variant, the E4, soon entered the scene, with a few minor improvements to the canopy and pilot armour. It also mounted the improved MG FFM cannon, which could fire the infamous Minengeschoss 20mm round with a far larger explosive filler. 1,276 E3s were produced alongside 561 E4s, but many E3s were retrofitted to E4 standard. These were the aircraft that would fight the Allied forces in France in 1940 and would be the aircraft flying over the Channel to tangle with Spitfires that summer. So how did they actually compare? Let's very quickly pit the Bf109 E4 against the Spitfire Mark 1A, the two quintessential fighters of the Battle of Britain. And looking at the numbers, they look almost identical, but they couldn't really be more different. The Spitfire had a big, large wing with nice elliptical ends. This lowered wing loading, which meant that the Spitfire could make far tighter turns than the 109. However, the Messerschmitt's higher wing loading and higher power to weight ratio as a whole meant it could accelerate faster, dive faster, and climb at a slightly higher rate than the Spitfire. Also, the 109 famously had a direct fuel injection system, while the Spitfire used a float carburetor. This meant that if you pitched forward into a dive, the DB601 would continue to work, but the negative Gs would flood the carburetor on the Spitfire, starving the engine of fuel at a critical moment. Essentially, the 109 had the advantage in the vertical plane. It would always aim to be climbing or diving. The Spitfire had the advantage in the horizontal, turning inside its opponent and getting its guns on target. Speaking of guns, the E4, as we know, had twin machine guns in the cowling and a cannon in each wing, while the Spitfire had 8 machine guns, 4 in each wing. With both aircraft, a lot of decisions were made that gave the two distinct advantages and disadvantages, especially when fighting each other. The decider, in the end, was almost always the skill and experience of the pilot at the controls. The Emil was constantly worked on, before, during and after the Battle of Britain. As a result, there were a whole handful of variants and sub-variants. The E5, E6 and E9 were all reconnaissance aircraft, the E7 had mountings for drop tanks, and the /N variants had the upgraded DB601N engine with a bit more power. But maybe the most interesting wasn't an Emil at all. The Bf109T was a seafaring variant based on the E7/N. The T was for Traeger Flugzeug, carrier aircraft, and this new aircraft was destined for use on the Kriegsmarine's mighty Graf Zeppelin class aircraft carriers, with an arresting hook and a 12% wider wingspan. However, the Graf Zeppelin was cancelled in 1943, and all Bf109 T1s had their carrier equipment removed, becoming T2s, and being deployed as coastal defence fighters in Norway. In hindsight, the 109s would have been nearly useless on a carrier given their woeful range, but it's the thought that counts. The whole Graf Zeppelin project was an intensely stupid idea. But 1943, I'm getting ahead of myself. Back in spring 1940, before the Germans had even invaded France, the Bf109 design team had been working on an update for the fighter, incorporating all the new aerodynamics research, as well as a much larger DB601E engine, providing some 1,350 horsepower, about a 35% boost in power. This was to become the Friedrich, the Bf109F. The Friedrich was a near complete overhaul of the Emil. Every single spar, rivet and panel was examined to see if it could be improved, and most were. This long list of changes on the screen doesn't even scratch the surface. The big changes were the curved wingtips to stop sudden stalls, the more aerodynamic front section and integrated spinner, the bigger engine, and at last, a 15mm cannon that was successfully mounted through the engine, firing at 960 meters per second as well. Small snag though, the DB601E power plant wasn't yet available, and neither was the 15mm cannon. So the 200 or so F0 and F1 aircraft used the less powerful DB601N and a lower velocity 20mm. The F2 would get the new 15mm cannon, while the F2 would get an even better 20mm cannon and the new engine. In the eyes of many 109 pilots, the F4 was the finest aircraft that Messerschmitt ever made. It had a higher top speed than the Emil, could accelerate, climb and dive a lot faster, it could turn more tightly, and the centre-mounted armament, while slightly weaker than the E4, was more precise and easier to aim. The pilot enjoyed new fuel tanks, thickened 6mm nose armour and a bulletproof windscreen. The F models first arrived in operational units in April 1941 and immediately became the bane of the RAF's existence, outclassing the Spitfire Mark IIs over the Channel and even having the edge over the new Spitfire Mark Vs in North Africa. When the Axis invaded the USSR in June 1941, the best German pilots were given the new aircraft and quickly started to rack up almost unbelievable numbers of kills against the inexperienced and technologically outmatched Soviet Air Force. You may have noticed that a moment ago I said this: the F4 was the finest aircraft that Messerschmitt ever made. And it's true. The F4 was likely the best version of the 109 in terms of handling and dogfighting. In some ways, the next model, the Bf109G, was a step backwards, but for some reason, they made 23,000 of them. Despite the success of the Friedrich, it was clear that there was only so much more that they could do with the aging DB601. It was decided that a new engine would be fitted to the Bf109, the DB605. This was developed from the DB601, so in theory it would be an easy swap, gaining about 120 horsepower and keeping the 109 relevant into the late war. Allied bombers were now in service that could fly at heights well exceeding 30,000 feet, so being able to climb quickly and engage this new threat was a priority. And to help make this happen, many of the new G model 109s would also have a pressurized cockpit. The new, heavier engine meant more torque, which meant reinforcing the wings and fuselage. To pressurize the cockpit, all external edges were sealed off, the canopy became double glazed, and the canopy and framing were all reinforced as well. And this was sort of fine. Despite being heavier, the G1 and G2 were still faster than the F4, especially when using the fancy GM1 nitrous injection system, but maybe couldn't turn quite as well. Big whoop, right? But the weight continued to rise. The G3 and G4 had larger, heavier wheels to try and make up for the heavier airframe. To enhance the firepower of the 109 against the bombers it was trying to shoot down, the 7.92mm machine guns were replaced with 13mm in the G5 and G6, which were heavier and came with some nasty, draggy bulges over the cowling, earning the aircraft the semi-affectionate nickname Bull, or Bump. Even this was nowhere near potent enough to reliably score kills in the new American heavy bombers once they entered the war, and many 109s were forced to carry heavy, draggy 20mm cannon pods under each wing to try and increase firepower. This trend of just adding more and more and more onto the aircraft continued all the way up to the G10, which mounted a more powerful DB605D engine, a larger supercharger, and improved aerodynamics on the cowling. The G model was the most common and most widely produced 109 of the entire war, and had a plethora of subvariants with different engines, guns, vertical stabilizers, radios, you name it. In no way was the G model a bad aircraft or a bad design though, far from it. By 1943, the 109 was 8 years old, and the Gustav was the only way it could possibly remain relevant in a sky full of late war Spitfires, Mustangs, and Thunderbolts. Anyway, by the late war, especially as the bombing campaign really started doing damage, the Luftwaffe was in a difficult spot. Fuel and raw materials were both becoming scarce, as were experienced pilots, who were dying faster than they could be replaced. Training had been shortened drastically, and while the Gustav could be a dangerous aircraft in the right hands, they were often placed in very young, very scared hands, and accidents skyrocketed while kills plummeted. The sprawling mess of G model variants in production led to the adoption of the final significant variant, the Bf109 K. This was designed to streamline and standardize the production process, and were, essentially, new build variants of the G10. To avoid the same issues, the pre-production K0, K1, K2 and K3 were never standardized, and Messerschmitt focused on the K4, which entered frontline service in October 1944. The methanol water injection system, MW50, was standard on the K4, and allowed the engine to briefly be boosted to 1800 horsepower. The K4 standardized many of the best features that were fitted onto some Gustavs, but was still stuck with a very lackluster armament and not even given factory mountings for underwing cannons, which is a bit bizarre. But of course, we all know that the war was already lost for the Germans and their Bf109s. Even with a force composed almost entirely of Focke-Wulfs, 109Gs and 109Ks, the losses of November 1944 were eye-watering as they engaged American bombers, escorted by P-51 Mustangs. 70 pilots killed in the 2nd, 62 on the 21st, 87 on the 26th, and 51 on the 27th. German pilots were now flying into combat outnumbered nearly 30-1 by Allied fighters. Even the introduction of the newfangled jet-powered Me-262 failed to make any impact on the disaster unfolding in the skies above Germany. The war was over, and the Germans had lost. But before we close the book on the 109, let's look at some strange variants that you might have suspected I wouldn't talk about, starting with the Bf109H back in 1942. This Hohenjäger altitude fighter was an attempt to raise the service ceiling of the F Model 109. They added 6.5 feet to the wingspan, widening the landing gear as they did so. This modification, along with a 1300 horsepower DB601E engine and a pressurized cockpit, allowed the Bf109H to operate at heights of up to 47,500 feet, over 6,000 feet higher than the K models of 1944. However, that said, it was inferior to Focke-Wulf's TA152H, which could reach 48,550 feet, and the 109H was cancelled. The ME209 first flew in November 1943 and was an attempt to drastically improve the 109 with a new engine, tail, wings and landing gear. It was better than the Bf109 and addressed many of the shortcomings, but it wasn't quite as good as the FW190D, and disrupting the massive production lines of the 109 for only a small performance boost compared to the G model was seen as a bit greedy, even by the Nazis. And then we get to by far the silliest design, the Bf109Z, Zwilling or twin. If you've ever seen the F-82 twin Mustang, it's literally just that, but with Bf109Fs. The center ring section was added and two 109s were mated to become one. This was intended to operate as a restorer, sort of like the Bf110, but it was damaged in an air raid in 1944 and never flew. At the end of the day, the Bf109 was an incredible aircraft that stayed in service far longer than it had any right to. Getting it so right back in 1935 was an impressive achievement, and the winning formula of the 109 meant it continued to be a threat until the very end of the war, with almost all of Germany's 5,000 aces flying the 109 for a significant chunk of their careers. But the end of the war didn't quite kill the 109. The production plants in the occupied Czech Republic were initially tooled for Bf109 G14s, and the new liberated Czech government realized that these could be used to create the backbone of the new air force. However, lacking DB605 engines, they substituted UMO 211s with big paddle propellers, producing an aircraft with, let's say, interesting handling characteristics. But dodgy 109s were better than no fighters at all, and these were produced as the Aviat S199, with 500 built between 1947 and 1949, and serving the Czechs well into the 1950s. They eventually sold some of them off to the Israelis, who operated them as the Sakin, or knife. The Spanish were in a similar predicament, with Bf109G2 airframes, but no engines. In the end, they fitted them with Hispano-Suiza engines, first the 1109J1L and then the K1L. These served until 1953, when the K1L engines were replaced with more powerful Rolls-Royce Merlins, which gave them a decent performance boost. 171 Buchons, or fat pigeons, continued to serve until 1967, when they were sold by the Spanish and began their new role of playing actual Bf109s in films, famously the 1969 film Battle of Britain, which used 28 of these as the dreaded yellow-nosed 109s. It's fitting perhaps that the first and last operational flights of 109s were both flown with Rolls-Royce power plants. Maybe the Spitfire and the Messerschmitt weren't so different after all. Well, you can now tell your Antons from your Emils and your Gustavs from your Buchons. To thank me for this service, I'd ask if you could subscribe to the channel below to get more content like this. If you want to support me further, I'd really appreciate if you consider supporting me on Patreon. Just $5 a month gets you early access to all my videos, access into the luxurious Red Wrench Lounge Discord, exclusive videos like this one, and it just helps me keep the lights on. As always, a big thanks to my existing Patreon supporters, and I'll see you all next time.